It is my great pleasure to introduce our two presenters. They're fond friends of MITX. They are the agency behind our Future M website, which if any of you have visited recently, you know just how beautiful it is and great to use. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to the two folks you're waiting to hear from, Nick Laidlaw, the CTO of Agency Oasis, and Jason Fields, the Vice President.
Thank you. Thanks. Welcome. We've got about 35 minutes to talk about a very specific subject. We're going to focus in on how we might want to use big data or analytics or transactional information to affect a positive engagement with users that come to websites. To do that, we're going to, as you can see, there's a little bit of a spooky theme to our slide deck here. Given that Halloween is the most significant holiday coming up, we thought it might be fun to play with that a little bit. So we've created sort of a fake experience that we can all use as a reference point to see how some of these methods might play out in the real world. So before we go any further, we thought we might take a straw poll of the audience just to see who we're dealing with.
So we wanted to find out a little bit about you, and we can also just tailor the presentation based off of some of your own experiences. So we wanted to ask a few questions. First of all, how many people here are part of an organization that has a dedicated IT team that's focused on web or digital?
Awesome.
Very good. That's great. And how many of you are part of an organization that stores transactional data?
All right. Groups getting smaller. How many people use third-party services to access data? Great. And then finally, how many people have a dedicated or a partially dedicated business analyst that's able to dive into the data and extrapolate meaning from the data itself? All right. So we figured that the groups would keep getting smaller over the course of those questions. So there's a mix of people in the room. Some people seem to have a lot of resources available to them to make these sort of decisions. Some people have limited exposure to those resources to make some decisions around big data. So we're going to talk about how you can use both of those availability of resources to make a stronger impact on your digital presence. So one of the questions that we get asked quite a bit, I mean, the buzzword of personalization and big data is in the marketplace pretty strong right now. When we talk with our clients, they say, well, why do I want to do this? I mean, we know we should be talking about it, but why should we actually activate it? Well, the quick, easy answers are most retailers out there in the business right now, about 61%, are saying that personalization is about the most important aspect of their interactive experience. And we can see that with places like Best Buy, Amazon, right? These big retailers that are, from a business standpoint, have the resources available to make these decisions are making them very impactfully about how they're engaging with their users by using transactional information, analytic information, and presenting to you what you should be looking at rather than letting you hunt and gather for it. And certainly from a lot of our perspectives, ours in particular, because we're an agency, so we service clients, there's $77 billion out there to go get. So if we can get good at this, there's a lot of revenue to rake in. So the first step, we think, as it pertains to big data and how big data affects personalization is to start dissecting the audiences. So here we're going with the Halloween theme. We've got an audience of zombies. Zombies are always looking for different stuff. They like brains. They also might be thirsty. Some zombies might like a cold beer or a gin and tonic. We don't really know, right? All zombies come to our experience. We don't know exactly what they're looking for. So one of the first things we want to do is identify the groups.
Yeah, and this is really when you start thinking about the data that you're collecting and how you can match it to the user groups or the visitors that are perhaps coming to your web properties or your digital properties. And what we like to do is to first, when we look at the data, start to look for trends, and this is really where big data and analysis comes into play. But when you start to look at those outcomes, you can apply them to specific profiles. So in our case, going with the zombie theme, we've got all different types of personas or personalities that we've come up with. And we find that it's actually a good practice to come up with terms or phrases that are memorable, ones that can actually help you to identify with a user group or a certain persona type.
Once you're able to put these groups together, you're able to do analysis and figure out how you want to target them.
So here, this is just a matrix. coming up with some of the different properties or some of the different characteristics of your personas. So perhaps some are thirsty, some are interested in beer, some are injured, some like to be on their own. So these are things that you can actually start to capture from the data that's being collected and analyzed, and now you can start to use that information to personalize the experience for anyone that's visiting your web properties or anyone that's visiting your digital properties.
I think this step can't be underestimated. I think when it comes to personalization, a lot of people think that there's some sort of silver bullet out there, that there's this magic algorithm that you can just plug into your website and it's just going to work. There's a tremendous amount of effort that goes into figuring this out for your business. Now, does it require you to spend weeks and weeks and months of analysis against huge sets of data that you're storing? Probably not. We all know our businesses pretty well, so we can make educated decisions about how we want to group our visitors or the people we're engaging with. But doing this up front is what's going to allow us to take in real time what people give us involuntarily, which is their click paths, where they're coming from, et cetera. It's this upfront work that's going to allow us to create that algorithm, if you will, or that decision engine to present that best piece of engagement to the user on the website. So welcome to Halloween Hollow. We said we were going to keep on a Halloween theme. We will. Halloween Hollow is a Halloween party costume supply store, and we built a website for them. What we did up front was we went ahead and went through the process that we're just talking to you guys about. We went ahead and created a matrix of people, divided them between naughty and nice, trick and treat, and decided that we were going to target very specific pieces of content to each of these persona groups. Once we have this, we're able to then map it against all of the different content we have on the site. We're going to take a very easy example of a homepage here in a minute. But this is that key moment, right, where we understand the people that we're targeting. So then we can map in everything else against it.
And there's a key premise there with that grid. Don't be afraid to just make an inference. If you are analyzing your data, if you don't see that clear crystal path, don't be afraid to make an inference and go for it. Because what you're going to find is that once you collect more data after you've made that jump, you'll be able to refine. So how do we use the data? So as we're collecting the data or any of the data that we have access to, how do we use this information to personalize a web experience? There's two different ways. There's explicit and then there's implicit. With explicit, we have specific information about a visitor that we can use to target content. So perhaps we know based off of information that a visitor has filled out what their interests are. We can explicitly direct them to certain content. But in the case where we don't know exactly what information is about a visitor, we can imply or implicitly push content to that visitor. So what are some examples of this? Perhaps we just know information about where the visitor is physically located, or a combination of where they're physically located and perhaps a keyword term that came through. We can use that information together to personalize the web experience for that visitor. So if we go back and look at this grid, now we can start to target one sector, and we can show you what that experience looks like with a web property that we created for this presentation. So here's the Halloween Hollow homepage, and again, this is just fictitious. Doesn't really exist out there.
So we thought about buying the URL.
Yeah. So with this homepage, you can see that this is very general. It's hard to target a product or specific services at this point if you don't know anything about the visitor that is coming to the website. So you want to make sure that you just generally try to present some of your offerings to hopefully get some more information as the person clicks through.
So let's take our first quadrant in the matrix. We've got our adult costume seeker. We know that they're naughty and they like to trick. So if we look at the homepage that we have originally for a completely anonymous user, we don't have any way to map them against the data that we're collecting on our general audience. So this is what we're going to give them. But as soon as we figured out that they are going to fall into a profile of the adult costume seeker, we're able to start making decisions about what we give them. So how did we get to this point? Well, you'll notice on the bottom right that what was find your location is now turned over to actually a Google map, right? We've all seen this before. This isn't terribly complex. We're using a very simple geo-IP lookup. It's a piece of data that's involuntarily given to us by the incoming IP address that's making the request for the page. So what else have we done here? On the bottom left, Halloween fun for kids. We've now changed over to adult costumes. So how do we do this? How many people have Google Analytics on their site or some sort of analytics package? Good, just about everybody. How many people are actively looking at the keywords that people are coming in on? How many people have a running list of the top 100 keywords that are bringing people to the site? How many people are taking that top 100 keywords and targeting it to specific content within your web property? Right? Yeah, so we got a so-so. So what we've done here is we've gone ahead fictitiously and we've taken a look at the top 100 keywords of the Halloween Hollow site over the course of, let's say, a quarter. We've analyzed how popular they are. If we're really aggressive, we've probably tracked how well the transaction rate is for those keywords. So for a particular keyword, a lot of people might be searching for it, but nobody actually buys anything, so it becomes less important to us, right? So what we've done is we've determined that somebody came in looking for adult costumes. We sniffed that out of the URL. We put it against our decisioning that we have in our website, and we decided to give them the adult costumes in the bottom left. We've also decided to keep costume rentals because somebody who's interested in adult costumes may actually want to rent something rather than buy it. And you'll notice that very easily the hero area of the homepage, that hero image, has changed as well, so that it is something visually more striking for the user that's coming in on that particular search. So here we've taken a huge data set, we've mined it down, extrapolated meaning, and we've applied it to the user.
So continuing on, so let's say we're dealing with a different segment. So now we've moved over into the quadrant where you're planning a party for adults. So based off of this information, we can now personalize the experience further. So again, just showing you what the default is, just to get everyone acclimated. Now if you move on, and here's a little hidden fact, Boston has been rated the heaviest drinking city in the country. Something to be proud of.
So we're skipping lunch and we're all going to the bar downstairs.
So perhaps you use that information because the only thing you know as the person is hitting the site is that they're coming from Boston. Again, make an inference, take a jump. Hopefully you can capture some more visits or further the experience for the visitor based off of that piece of information that you've inferred. It can be taken further. We showed some examples of just taking a hero section, so that main area on the home page, some of the call-outs. So for example, the location area on the bottom corner, and some of the other promotional areas. But personalization using this data can also be used to personalize the actual user experience in the navigation as well. So we've seen quite a bit organizations that will just take one area and use data that is coming in from the visit and personalize that one area, but you can take it much further than that.
So we move on to our next segment, the kids costume seeker. We can assume this is probably a parent, but if they're seeking kids costumes, we probably don't want to show them a page full of booze or the naughty nurse costume that we're trying to sell them. So we want to be a little bit more sensitive about it, right? So back to the original, we don't know anything about people. This is what we're going to give them. But now we know something different, right? Of course, we could use all of the methods that we talked about a few minutes ago. We could infer business meaning against IP lookup. We can change the map. We can use search term query. We can put all that against the data we're collecting and mining internally. But here's an interesting option where, in this experience, we're actually using a third-party network that we subscribe to from an ad network perspective, and we're using the data that they're sending us to understand that of all the other sites that the person has been to, before they got to us, without knowing how they got there, where they came from, they've been looking at stuff about kids. So we pull that data in from the third-party ad network. We translate it on our system, and so what we show them for the first time when they show up is information and a selling point about kids' costumes. Now, we could couple this with a lot of other information to even tailor it further. But just by allowing data that's being stored by a third-party network that we're not even housing internally, we're allowed to and enabled to customize that visual experience, that selling experience, the engagement experience for the user.
So again, moving the quadrant. So now we're moving to the section of people that are planning a party for kids. So going on to the homepage example again. Everyone's familiar with it, the default. But now, perhaps you're using some explicit information that you know about the consumer. You know that this individual has made a purchase before for party supplies. And perhaps you also are aggregating information from third-party networks that tells you that they have children. So with that in mind, again, another condition that we're able to use to drive and personalize the content, showing imagery of party supplies, the tagline that's up in the top left. These are all ways, again, to personalize that experience and, again, to hopefully drive conversions higher.
And you could change the business rules around this, right? Nick mentioned transactional information. So perhaps they came here once and they bought the pumpkin cup, so we presume that they're coming back for something else. But maybe the last time they were here, they bought costumes for 2 or 3 kids. So since we know the last time they were here and we stored that transactional information on what they purchased, we can make an educated decision that from a business standpoint, if they've already bought costumes, this time they might be back for party supplies. So we're able to mine that information and put it into a category, map it against the content that we have in our content management system, and then pair it up against the user personas that the user is falling into when they come into the site.
All right, so we went through some really nice examples. They're all packaged up perfectly, and everyone says, that's really nice, but how do I do this for real? The reality is the examples that we gave, those are all possible, those are all doable. These are all things that we've done. So what do you need to consider if you're going to try to aggregate big data, use the results, and actually use that for personalization purposes? First thing you're going to need to do is to conduct a data inventory. So what information are you collecting, whether you know it or not? So as an example, information that you may not know that you're collecting just through your analytics applications or services may be information about the operating system that the person's using, which you all know if you can go to some reports on what people use certain operating systems, you can make some inferences based off of that. And that's information that you're just collecting through your third-party analytics providers.
Does anybody remember that story about Orbitz and the Macintosh operating system, or OS X? A couple of years ago, Orbitz got dinged because they figured out that people that were surfing their site on Macs were getting a higher cost than people that were on IBMs or PCs, because they were jacking the price because they figured if people had Macs, they had more money to spend on travel.
Good point.
Which is why I surf only those sites on my PC.
Only on the PC, yeah.
PC, just for that reason.
Yeah. The other point, where are you getting your data? Where is it coming from? Is it data that you're actively collecting as part of your own corporate data store? Or is this information that's coming across via every request that comes through every HTTP request? Is it information that you're getting from a third party? Consider where that data is coming from, how you're going to aggregate it, and how you want to decision against it. Does the data analysis that you make match the personas or the profiles or audience segments that you've determined from the beginning? If not, you may have to go back and make some adjustments. You may find just from doing an analysis on your data that you need to make some changes in terms of what you think your personas are, what your profiles are. And this kind of goes along with that last point. Can you actually match your data against your content? So in the examples that we gave, if you don't actually have content that matches against someone that is planning a party for kids, you may need to go back and pull some content together, pull some messaging together to make that match. I think one thing to keep in mind throughout this process is that it is iterative. It's not just set and forget. It's something that you have to go back, analyze, and make some adjustments, so keep that in mind. And this is a last point, and this is a way to actually get value out of this process. Set up trigger points throughout the process. So if there's a certain piece of content that you've created and you've presented to the visitor, and that person interacts, set up a trigger point to do something else, whether it's to just capture additional information, mark that data that has come through at that point because that's something that you want to analyze further. Just make sure that you set up that trigger point to create an action. So, go back one.
Yep.
Some things to consider beyond just the content, the data, the analysis. Here are some of the blocking and tackling activities that are involved that you need to make sure you're covered as well. I think some of you, actually quite a few of you who have an IT team, you're in actually very good shape. So a basic thing is your site dynamic? Is it application driven, application code driven? So that just means, can it adjust on the fly? Can you put business logic into your web application? I think for the vast majority of you, the answer is probably yes. Is your site database driven? Again, can you present content on the fly? And I think, again, for most of you, this would apply, so you're in a great position. Can you query big data? So this is an area that continues to improve, but for many applications or many technologies, we're not really there yet. It's very difficult to query against big data directly. So for many, you have to rely on third-party services to do that. And the last point is just a point to take home. Content management systems have actually come quite a long way in terms of personalizing content using information that is coming from big data. In particular, having the ability to make decisions on the fly. So to take information that comes in, to use rules that you've configured, and to then present the appropriate content.
I think one of Nick's points deserves to be seconded here, which is it's very difficult to plug the systems that are managing your digital presence directly into big data, especially when you think of things like transactional data. Many of us have warehouses that are terabytes and terabytes huge, if not larger, with data on all of the users that we have, all of the customers that have engaged with us, all of the transactions that we have. If you try to set up a system that actually connects into those databases and tries to parse out those transactions in real time to give your user a more valuable engagement, you're setting yourself up for success. And that's why one of the questions, you're setting yourself up for failure, which is one of the reasons we ask how many people have business analysts. Because what you really need to do is you need to mine that data and use that data to infer generalities so that you're hitting a broader stroke of people when they come to your site rather than trying to tailor everything for that unique individual. So it's always, as Nick said earlier, it's iterative. You want to start big and then get more granular with how you use big data to personalize your content. So one of the questions we get quite often from our clients is, when does it get creepy? Because we have all of these powerful tools accessible to us, and you could come to our website and we could try to sell you a Lexus with air conditioning and heated seats because we've inferred that from all of this data that we've collected on you from other websites or from previous visits. That gets a little weird. One of the stories that we like to tell is probably one that a lot of people in the room know, which is the Target pregnancy story. Anybody recall that? So the quick version of the story is that Target hired a guy that was a wonderful and just a genius data analyst. And what he did is he figured out a way based on spending patterns within the store to actually figure out when women were pregnant. He did this so well that he actually figured out a 16-year-old girl was pregnant before her father knew. And he sent to their house an ad booklet, a coupon booklet for pregnancy items. And the father found out that a 16-year-old was pregnant that way. They've since tailored back these couponers that they send out, and so when they know someone's pregnant, which they still do, they actually mix it in with things that aren't applicable so it doesn't seem so weird. But the rule of thumb here is, when I go into Starbucks, if I go into the same one every day, that barista probably knows exactly what I want, right? I don't have to order my coffee or my latte anymore. When I walk in, they see me and they give it to me. But that's familiar. I know why they're doing that for me. That level of personalization, customization is natural because I've created that rapport. You want to be able to do the same thing on your own digital properties. If out of the gate the first time a visitor comes to you, you give them exactly what they need, you know them by name, you're telling them their phone number, and you're giving them precisely what they're looking for, it's going to seem a little odd to them. So what you want to do is to try to grow that engagement over time. Customers are getting very savvy, especially online, and so they understand that the more information they give you, the better and more precise you can be with what you're offering them from an engagement standpoint. So just don't overshoot it, I guess, is the message. And sort of take the cues from real life.
Yeah, another real life example is with Netflix. Probably a lot of Netflix subscribers here. I'm one. And I have kids. I have a single account. Apparently, all I watch are kids shows. Just in Time. What are some of these other ones? Phineas and Ferb. That's all I watch apparently, and that's the only thing that I see. So, a key point in that real example is just because you have the data doesn't mean that it's the absolute truth. So, how do you get around that? Let your visitors interact back with your web property. Let them give you data, give you feedback. So in that case, I'd love to be able to say, that's great, but I really also like this, or this isn't me today. But there isn't really that type of mechanism for feedback. So when you're considering using data for personalization purposes, also consider some ways to give the visitor a mechanism to give feedback, to give you more data. I mean, how many opportunities do you have to actually get information from your consumers? And this is a great way to do it.
One of the things we've had some success with is we work with a number of hospital networks in healthcare, and one of the things that we do with them is as they start looking at information, we start assessing what we think they're there for. And so we actually show them, we think you're here for this, and at any point they can tell us, no, I'm not actually here for this, and it actually decreases the decisioning we need to make and gives us better inputs in order to give them information. And people are using it. People are getting very used to it.
So what are your options here in terms of implementing personalization using big data, or any data for that matter? So there's basic, intermediate, and advanced in our minds. So base needs, I think a lot of you have already covered. We actually talked about some of these points, having an application-driven site, database-driven site, and a development team that has a full understanding of business rules and business logic that can be used to provide a direct response. So the intermediate approach is to actually personalize key areas or promotions based off of aggregated data. So this could be data that you've pulled from a variety of sources. You've then processed that, spit out the result, and then mapped it to some content. And that leads to the more advanced approach, which allows your marketing teams, your editorial teams to actually create the conditions, create the rules, and direct the web application in terms of how they should use that information and tie it into content. That's the most advanced. And that involves the full process of making sure that you categorize all of your visitors, mapping your data, understanding the different conditions, and then actually applying those to a CMS-enabled web property.
So what you might need internally in terms of skill sets, because this is one thing that we get all the time from our clients, which is fantastic. You built this very powerful engine. You gave us a Ferrari, but we don't have anybody internally that knows how to drive a Ferrari. What you're typically going to need, and we mentioned it sort of at the beginning, having somebody that is actually in charge of ensuring the integrity of the data store is very important. But that's just one piece. Having somebody on board that's able to analyze that data, take the export, dig into it, mine it, categorize it, and abstract it into a level that's going to be useful for you on a digital platform. Time dedication-wise, it really depends on the size of your organization. We've seen organizations be successful with this with a team as few as 5, sometimes even less than that, depending on the pace with which you want to affect this change on your digital space. But you can certainly go as large as teams of 12 or 15, depending. If you're a high transaction site, you're actually driving a lot of revenue through through your websites or through your digital properties, you likely have greater access to resources to affect this sort of change. So depending on the resources available to you, you're probably looking at making sort of incremental progress over the state of quarters. If you have a lot of resources to you, you should be able to plan this out probably within about 3 months, abstract your data stores, data warehouses into meaningful information for your web properties, and actually get it into place in somewhere between 3 and 6 months.
And remember to plan that this is an iterative process, so plan those checkpoints to go back in, analyze the information, and make adjustments. Because if you think it's set and forget, then you're going to find that things will die out or fizzle out very quickly because you're not reacting to the additional information that you're able to now capture.
Which is just job security for all of us.
So what do you do when things go wrong? So we kind of talked about the Netflix example, talked about Target. So how do you make adjustments? This is iterative, so how do you go back and make some changes? So we already talked about the suggestion to provide a mechanism for feedback for your visitors so that you're able to then take that information, make the adjustment, so that for that next visit, or even maybe it's that current visit, when the visitor gives you some information, you can make some adjustments on the fly. It's pretty amazing that if you can just admit during a browsing experience that, oh yeah, we thought you were this person, but you're really here, that the visitor will respond well to that because they recognize that, okay, things are changing on the fly, let's continue. And let's continue to browse. Let's see what other changes might come into play based off of my browsing experience.
I think the key thing for us with a lot of the people that we work with is that you have a mechanism for understanding when you're wrong. A lot of marketers, a lot of marketing departments just put things in play and presume they're going to work, and if they see an uptick in conversions or transactions, they presume it was their brilliant decision that actually caused that. Being wrong is actually just as important as being right when it comes to personalization and using big data stores, because being wrong tells you it excludes the options for being wrong in the future, whereas being right doesn't do that. So manage expectations internally, make sure you have a long-term plan, be able to track your failures and your successes so that you can understand the value of both and message that correctly across your organization. I think we have 3 minutes left for questions and answers if there are any. Yep.
I have a question. So this is really consumer-oriented. What do you do when you're in a B2B environment and you do have some data points, but they're on a much higher level, not as granular. You don't have an ad network plugged in, which I would love to have, but I don't have it. So what would you recommend in terms of strategy? You know what kind of pages people are visiting, but in a B2B environment, when you have done one project with them, you never know what is on their mind for the next project. So how do you manage to serve them content they were looking for in the past, but also to spike their interest into other areas you can provide them with?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's the mix of implicit and explicit personalization, because you have a little bit of information about what they've done with you in the past, but at the same time, you don't really know what other services they may be interested in. And this is where having a content management system becomes a real benefit. Advanced content management systems give you the ability to actually score your content. So if you have the customer in one bucket when they start out based off of explicit information that you know about them, but then you see them going down a different path based on how you've scored content on other pages, you can reclassify that individual and continue to tailor the experience for them based on their click path.
I think part of it, too, is having very well-related content, tagging your content in your system well enough so that when they start giving you this involuntary data about what they're looking at, you can actually make sort of a numerical decision about what they might be interested in. I mean, that happens a lot on B2B sites where it's not product-driven, it's almost services-driven at some points. So if you can generate content that has a very specific message and they latch onto that, you can assign persona values against that. So it takes a little bit of reworking on the content.
And if you don't have a content management system that can do this sort of thing, scoring content and switching out the content on the fly, pass data into your third-party analytics tool. So you can still tag your pages with certain categories or pieces of information that help you to classify the visitor. Pass that information in. Perhaps you're putting through a unique identifier for the visitor so that you can just start to capture more information about that particular visitor, and you'll have something to go back and use for analyzing purposes down the road.
Great presentation, thank you. I'm not sure it's on, but ROI. Mm-hmm. So have you been able to assure any marketer before they write the check to say, so Jason, you know, when do I get my money back? I mean, can you use ranges of sorts? Because I'm sure obviously it depends, but typically how do you answer that question? I'm guessing I'm not the first one to ask it.
No, you're not. This is going to sound like an agency answer. We throw the question back on the business. I mean, how are you tracking ROI to date on the site? If we have that system available to us, we can sort of guarantee that we're going to improve that. A lot of companies don't use the same ROI model, so we tend not to say that we've got an actual solution for that. We back in what we can do from a technological and creative standpoint into the ROI model that they have and find out where the trigger points are in that revenue generating model that we can start affecting positively. And it's important to do that, we think, to adopt rather than define the ROI model for a business, because it allows us to be very selective about those trigger points that we're going to have the most impact on.
I think that's our time. Want to thank you all for joining us today. If you have any questions, feel free to find us. We'll be hanging out outside this room for a few minutes.